Hello and welcome to another episode of A Spoonful of History. Today we are going to start lecture 2 or part 2 of a 3-part series on the American Revolution. First of all, I like to call this episode Stepping Stones because it's the different things that happened as leading up to the American Revolution, and it really all begins with the French and Indian War. When we talk about the French and Indian War, I want you to understand that it's basically the French aligned with certain Native American Indian tribes like the Mohawk Indians around the Great Lakes area, and then the British and Americans, and it's basically those groups that are fighting each other. And the reason why the French and the Indians are aligned and fighting each other, the reason that the French and the Indians were fighting each other was that England and France were engaged in a war going on, and France decided that they wanted to take the war to the New World, and so they aligned themselves with Indians that were very upset with the American colonists encroaching on their land. So that is the reason why the French and the Indians were aligned. The Americans obviously aligned with their British brethren. Long story short, Britain won, and even though Britain wins and they win all of this area here, the light green with the line, it's an incredibly costly war, and Britain is in deep debt because of that, and they need someone to help pay off that debt, and the British citizens are looking to the New World to basically help pay that debt. This leads to the Proclamation Line of 1763, where if you look at this red line going right here, this goes along the Appalachian Mountains. And basically the British made this proclamation prohibiting American colonists from going beyond and inhabiting the area in the Indian Territory beyond this red line, the Proclamation Line of 1763, because they were too tired of spending a lot of money protecting the Americans from the Indians and other hostiles. So they basically said, you need to stay on this side of the line. Another reason why they wanted them to stay along the eastern side of the coast is because that's where the markets were, and then if the Americans are near the markets, then guess what? They're going to be buying British goods, paying the taxes, and help paying off that debt. American colonists did not like this limit, especially when you had people like Patrick Henry and George Washington that were surveying and owned a lot of the land in what is now modern-day Kentucky. This leads to a succession of different taxes and acts led to not punish the American colonists, but to help pay for the war. And remember, American colonists were not entirely upset with having to pay taxes. Nobody wants to pay taxes, but they understood it was a necessary evil. They just wanted to make sure, because they were used to representative government, and remember that all the ideas of the Age of Reason, limited government, representative government, the idea of being born equal in the eyes of God, and that we are all born with certain inalienable rights. American colonists, that was what they believed in, that's who they were, and when they just wanted representation in Parliament, if they were going to be paying taxes, they wanted to have a say over their destinies. The British started, to pay back the debt, they started with a tax on sugar, which if you think about it, is in almost everything. Even to this day, sugar is in everything from alcohol to breads to anything else. Americans, colonists, become incredibly angry over this because they didn't have a say in it. Remember this idea of no taxation without representation. So they begin to boycott the Sugar Act. Because of this, as a result of this, Britain is going to reduce the Sugar Act because the Americans become very, very angry, but instead they impose a thing called a Stamp Act, which basically is a stamp on all printed materials, playing cards, newspapers, birth certificates, anything that is printed had to have this stamp on it, which basically said that a tax had been paid. American colonists saw it for what it was and began to riot. They began to tar and feather tax collectors, burn government buildings, etc. So Britain will quickly repeal the Stamp Act, but then as soon as they did that, they are going to issue the Declaratory Act, which basically says that anything Britain says goes, and the colonists have no say over it. So it's like, we're going to make you do it whether you like it or not. Obviously, this does not go over very well with the American colonists. Part of this is the Quartering Act, where colonists are forced to house soldiers in their own homes. Even that Quartering Act did not go over well with British people in England, so it is quickly repealed. But the haunting of having to have these soldiers stay in our houses still haunt Americans today, and in fact, it's the Third Amendment, no quartering of troops. After this, the Townshend Act basically taxes all everyday goods like lead, paint, glass. As a result, the colonists are going to boycott or refuse to buy British goods out of protesting. So this leads Britain to basically repeal all taxes except for the tax on tea, which is the most popularly drank beverage in the world then, and it still is today. This leads to the Boston Massacre, and as we talked about in class, the Boston Massacre really is a brilliant form of propaganda, and a picture tells 1,000 words, and this picture tells 1,000 kind of half fake words in a way, that it was really a very sad, horrible, tragic event for 5 individuals that did lose their lives, including the first African American who was shot immediately, Crispus Attucks, who was one of the first, and he happened to be a freed African American. But basically what happened was American colonists, late one night, basically in March, are assembled, and they're very rowdy, protesting the taxes. They're screaming, they're yelling, they become unruly, they're throwing snowballs, oyster shells, rocks, and then the British soldiers, one gets hit in the head and falls, and a gun goes off. Out of the confusion, the British soldiers are going to level their muskets and shoot into the crowd. Preston will have them cease fire and regroup, but 5 are dead. This is the rallying point for the American Revolution, even though it was an accident, and those British soldiers will go free. John Adams, second president of the United States, will actually defend the British soldiers. They will go free because it really was an accident. But regardless of that, this picture really painted what Paul Revere wanted all Americans to see, and it really unites the colonists with one common idea, vocabulary, and thought process, as that the British are clearly tyrants. The next thing, because remember I told you that they got rid of all the taxes except for the tax on tea, colonists begin to boycott the taxes and boycott tea. So Britain basically gives the East India Tea Company a break and allow them to sell their tea at a very low price. It's almost like the Walmart of the Walmartization of the colonies, that allowed them to sell their tea at a very low price to pretty much try to break this boycott. As a result, the Sons of Liberty, this rebel group disguised as Native American Indians, will throw millions of dollars worth of tea into the harbor, creating the biggest cup of tea in history. In England, the Parliament and the King are going to flip their lid over this because they see this as an act of terrorism. This leads to the Intolerable Acts. This is what the Americans actually call it. The English call it the Coercive Acts, and it was meant to punish Massachusetts. And what they did is Britain sent 4,000 extra troops, put Boston under martial law, under military law. They are going to close Boston Harbor. No ships go in or out of Boston Harbor. In fact, ships heading for Boston were diverted to Quebec. No trade equals no money. And then they closed down their representative government there in Boston. They suspend the colonial legislature and put it under British law. This is going to lead to a bunch of leading citizens writing each other and deciding that we need to meet to discuss what is going on. Remember, this is 1774, so they're not at independence yet. The vast majority of colonists still think what's going on is just strictly being punished in Boston, but they need to help and support their patriots, but they're not yet there to declare independence. So 12 out of the 13 colonies will show up to Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress, all except for Georgia. And they will debate on what should they do about Great Britain. And at this point, they still believe it's the legislature, it's the parliament that is to blame, not King George. So what they will do is they will support their Bostonian allies, their friends, and continue the British boycott and petition the king. But they will also go home and begin to prepare for war by creating and training citizen militias. But remember, they're not there yet. They're not at war yet. They still think they can fix things and things will become better. This leads to Lexington and Concord, April 19th, 1775. This is where the British get word that Sam Adams and John Hancock are in a town about 10 miles outside of Boston called Lexington. And a neighboring town called Concord has guns stored by the colonists. So the British decide they can do this 1-2 punch and hopefully end all of this rebellious spirit in Boston by arresting Sam Adams and John Hancock, as well as destroying all of the weapons in Concord. Preston, Dawes, and Paul Revere get word, and they will ride into the countryside late that night to warn the American colonists that the regulars are coming. The regulars are coming, not the redcoats, but the regulars are coming. Paul Revere will be arrested, but let go, and his horse being taken, and he and Dawes will actually be will get to Sam Adams and John Hancock in Lexington around midnight to be able to warn them, and Preston will actually be able to get to Concord and get all the weapons moved before the British actually ever get there. So that morning, when the British enter Lexington, the first shots fired that are heard around the world. Okay, and this basically starts the American Revolution. And when the smoke clears, about 8 colonists were killed, and they will basically retreat and go into Concord to back up their colleagues that are actually moving the weapons. As the British move on into Concord, they once again get involved in combat, and then when the Americans leave, the British troops will realize that basically they did not basically accomplish their task of capturing Hancock or Adams, nor destroying all the weapons. So exhausted and defeated, they march back to Boston, and as their march back to Boston, they keep getting ambushed by guerrilla warfare tactics, and over 200 British soldiers are killed on the trip back. Now this is the rallying call, and the colonists rally to fight. But remember, this is 1775, so technically the war starts in 1775. Declaration of Independence is not signed until 1776. So we're still a long way from the colonies all being united. But as a result of the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, or the intolerable acts as a result of the Boston Tea Party, and then the firing on these quote-unquote innocent rebels in Lexington and Concord, really begin to capture the hearts and minds of the colonists, and slowly but surely Boston and the people of New England begin to win the colonies to declare independence. That will conclude the stepping stones of the American Revolution. Our last and third installment will be basically the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution itself. Until next time, thank you guys very much, and I hope this helps.